Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on achieving a managed fossil fuel phase-out, retrofitting and repurposing coal power plants in Asia. This session is co-hosted by the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, also known as the CEET, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. My name is Liz Nelson, and I'm a program manager at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and I work with the CEET. I'd first like to provide some quick background on our host organizations. So for the CEET, under the auspices of the United Nations Secretary General, the CEET is a global high-level body of engineers and energy systems experts contributing to the UN Secretary General's goal of building a coalition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The CEET is co-chaired by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN. And now for UNIDO. UNIDO is the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and the primary objective of UNIDO is to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development. Their priority areas of focus include supporting sustainable supply chains for developing countries, and limiting climate breakdown through renewable energy and energy efficiency, and ending hunger by cutting post-harvest losses. Third, we have the UNFCCC, which stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The objectives of this organization is to advance work that stabilizes greenhouse gas concentrations. And the UN Climate Change also hosts the Global Innovation Hub, which was launched in 2021 at COP26 and seeks to promote transformative innovations for a low emission and climate resilient future. And last but certainly not least, ESCAP, which is the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, is one of 5 UN regional hubs, which covers 59% of the world's population, 49% of global energy demand, and 57% of global fuel-related greenhouse gas emissions. The Commission promotes cooperation amongst its 53 member states and 9 associate members to solve sustainable development challenges. So today, we're joined by a fantastic group of speakers, which I will introduce very shortly. But before we hear from our first speaker, I want to share the session agenda and a couple of reminders for everyone. For the agenda, we'll first hear from a few of our experts through 4 introductory flash talks before we begin our panel discussion with everyone. A quick note that this session will be recorded and the recording will be available to watch after the session on the SDSN YouTube channel. Additionally, please use the chat box or Q&A function to share comments and questions for the presenters and panelists. One of our team members will be monitoring your questions, and we'll have some time at the end of the session to discuss a few of them. Great. So with all of that being said, I'm very happy to invite Rana Ghanem to join us for our opening remarks. Rana is the Chief of the Energy and Climate Action Division at UNIDO, and also is a co-chair proxy for the CEET. So Rana, whenever you are ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz, and thanks to SDSN for this good partnership in hosting the CEET and for all the engineers who are members of CEET for really the work that has gone into the preparation of these briefs. We're also very delighted to see that we have also organizations from across the UN system, whether UNFCCC or UNESCAP, also joining us in the discussion today. I'd like to start perhaps just by painting the picture as to why these briefs are quite important at the present time and what's the content behind. And essentially, we know, according to the International Energy Agency, that the power sector is the single largest source of CO2 emissions globally, with around 40% of the CO2 emissions globally estimated to come from this sector. Transitioning the power sector to net zero targets is also a very important parameter in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And when we look into the concentration of where actually coal-fired power capacity is at the moment, over 75% of that capacity which is amounting to around 1,700 gigawatts, is concentrated actually in Asia. And so Asia really presents a very important opportunity for us to tackle the coal transition and to really bring on board a transformational change with regards to the production of energy. Now, when we look at the coal-fired power plants in Asia, there's about 105 gigawatts that are already in existing plants that do still have around 13 years of age, whereas there's about 18 gigawatts of planned new capacities. And together, these capacities would actually be around $100 billion of investments that if we are to really look into the repurposing or the replacement of these, we would end up in stranded assets that are equivalent to around 100 billion. And so it is a very, very important timeline as well now ahead of the COP30 and before 2030 to start investing and putting those investments into areas which can create jobs, which can also reduce emissions, and which really provide economies with more prosperity. So the briefs today, which as you mentioned also, Liz, are really going to focus on the coal transition in Asia and also the repurposing. They're particularly giving attention to policy, finance, and just transitions. And they're really examining how the managed fossil fuel phase out can happen in this region. There's a combination also of looking at some of the challenges along with some of the case studies and best practices that are happening in the region. Now, from a UNIDO standpoint, it is a very, very important discussion that must go hand in hand, both the energy transition and the industry transition, and bring along as well all the climate commitments and ambitions. And that's why we are focusing on ensuring not only that the just energy transition is technically feasible and climate aligned, but also that it does help create for our member states jobs in the right sectors. So I really hope that you'll gain a lot more insights from the engineers joining us and also the experts from sister UN agencies, and that we would really come up with solid recommendations also to bring into the briefs that we'll be launching. Thank you so much for joining the webinar, and wishing you all a great discussion. So thanks a lot. I'll pass back over to you, Liz.
Great. Thank you, Rana, for that background and stage setting details about why this topic is so important. We'll now turn to our first Flash Talk presenter, which will be discussing the UNFCCC negotiations. So I'd like to introduce Nitin Arora, who will be representing the UNFCCC for this session.
Thank you, Liz, for introducing me, but let me just take a minute to introduce myself as well. My name is Nitin Arora. I'm the project manager of UN Climate Change Global Innovation Hub, which was an initiative of the Secretariat launched at COP26 in Glasgow. I'm also the lead of the stakeholder engagement team of Article 6 here at the Secretariat. So these are the two hats which I'm wearing. I'm also the member of the steering committee of the CEET, sitting on the chair on behalf of the UNFCCC. So I'm really happy to be here talking through some of the negotiation items related to energy transitions that have been undertaken within the international negotiation process. Again, Rana has highlighted the need for energy transition and especially the need for a just and equitable transition. That is something which is the focus of my presentation, and later in the panel discussion we'll touch upon more on that. So maybe we can move to the next slide, Liz, please. Just to give you a background where this has started. Actually, it started much before COP26 with the adoption of the Paris Agreement at COP21. There was this target of 1.5 degrees centigrade that the parties and the countries need to achieve. And from there on, the intense negotiation had started on having solid decision texts in the international negotiation process. without much luck before COP26, but at COP26 there was a concrete outcome in terms of parties taking a decision in terms of phasing down unabated coal power energy systems, which then at COP27 stalled a little bit because of the energy security crisis issues, and there was a mixed progress in terms of international negotiations on energy transition. But we achieved a great success at COP28 in Dubai, wherein during the global stocktake process of the negotiations, parties have taken a strong stand in terms of taking a decision that there's a need to transition away from fossil fuel, which was then embedded in the decision text of COP28 outcome. Again, at COP29, there were talks about operationalizing the decision that was taken at COP28 in Dubai. There were some solid discussions that happened around clean transition. And you see that global energy storage and grids pledge, in which the parties had agreed to have an energy storage capacity of 1,500 gigawatt that was agreed upon at COP29 in Baku. We are very optimistic about the outcomes at COP30 in Belém in Brazil on issues related to energy transition. And we are very hopeful that parties will eventually agree to a solid decision at COP30. Next slide, please. Well, under the negotiation process, there are 4 central themes on clean energy transition. I've mentioned to you about the decision at COP28 in Dubai, where parties agreed to transition away from the fossil fuel. That was a central theme of phasing out fossil fuels. The parties have also realized that the most important theme in phasing out fossil fuel is just transition. So this transition away from the fossil fuel should be in a fair and inclusive manner. It should be just and equitable, especially to those communities, those parties who are highly dependent on fossil fuel industry. Then the next goal or the next transition theme was around renewable energy goals. The parties at COP29 in Baku agreed to tripling of renewable energy capacities by 2030. They have also realized the need for a large investment in clean energy infrastructure, including energy storage and grid modernization. Of course, the 4th and the most important transition theme is around the means of implementation, particularly for those countries who are vulnerable and have less means to implement clean energy transition. So the parties agreed to provide financial support and technology transfer to decarbonize energy systems for the developing country parties. So these are the 4 transition themes which are critical. And as we've noticed that this webinar is focused on actually phasing out of the fossil fuels, but by retrofitting and repurposing fossil fuel power plants in Asia, which is a central theme of negotiation process as well, that this transition has to happen in a controlled way, in a just transition way. So we'll discuss more about it in our panel discussion in later on. So that's all from my side in terms of how negotiation processes are moving ahead. Will, as mentioned by Liz earlier, be happy to take questions later on after the panel discussion. So over to you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nitin, for that presentation and for giving our audience a bit of background around these international negotiations and telling the story of how we've gotten to this point so far. We're now going to turn to our second flash talk, and I would like to introduce Emi Gouid to share her presentation, which will focus on the technical feasibility of navigating the coal transition in Asia. And this presentation is based on a recent CEET issue brief on this topic.
Thanks, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here together with colleagues from UNIDO, UNFCCC, ESCAP, and the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition. to discuss coal transition in this webinar. So among many topics my research covers in energy transition and sustainable development at Monash University, just coal transition is certainly the most challenging yet most urgent to be addressed to advance climate and net zero goals in the region. So there is still over 2,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants around the world, and accounted for 36% of global emission in 2024, as Rana just mentioned as well. Despite many countries has pledged net zero targets, there has been growing coal consumptions in China, India, Southeast Asia, where demand declined in some other parts of the world, in European Union, United States. And we are glad to have heard in the last week that Latin America has cancelled all its planned coal power plants, which has really set a very encouraging example for the rest of the developing world. So to phase down and to decarbonize these coal-fired power stations, over 1,600 gigawatts, relatively young coal-fired power plants in the Asia region really present the biggest barrier to achieve net zero by mid-century. So in this context, together with my colleagues at the CEET, in the brief Navigating Coal Transition in Asia, we examined what technologies, mechanisms, applications, and pathways will create conditions and enable mobilizing public and private sector finance, international and development resources to phase down coal-fired power plants and to scale up clean technologies rapidly. We focused on a number of questions: what technical or technological options are there to reduce coal usage in electricity generation, what instruments and measures are being employed by countries, and what lessons can be learned from other countries, both within the region and across the globe, and what are possible pathways in phasing out coal-fired power plants in the region. So through the process, looking at different practices in reducing the use of coal in power generation, we identified, could you please go to the next slides? We identified some strategies from policy, finance, market, technical, and regional perspective. As you can see in the figure, regulatory and financial measures can be implemented in general, a very short time frame. For example, modify the dispatch merit order to reduce the dispatch of coal-fired power plants, implement coal production caps, increase emission standards of generation assets, mandatory shutdown inefficient small-sized coal units. Worth mentioning that Stop Coal Finance has been the key driver for the cancellation of coal-fired power generation projects around the world. Market measures also including putting a price on carbon, implementing marginal cost pricing, dynamic pricing for electricity, which will help to incentivize zero marginal cost renewable generation over fossil fuels. Technical solutions, for example, retrofitting, repurposing of existing cogeneration assets. Of course, this will be covered very extensively by my colleague Jaideep in this session as well. At the system level and the regional level, more rapid development of clean and renewable energy efficiency, regional initiatives, for example, increasing connectivity of power systems, regional carbon markets, will all weaken the economic case for coal plants and creating conditions for transitioning away from coal. I'll pass it back to you, Liz, and look forward to the ongoing discussion on this topic.
Great. Thank you, Emmy, for that presentation and for sharing a little bit more about the information that was included in the issue brief as well. I'd now like to turn to our third presenter and introduce Jaideep Sandhu, who will be presenting on the technical aspects and challenges to the coal transition, including retrofitting and repurposing options as well. Jaideep, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Liz. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm Jaideep Sandhu. I'm privileged to be a CEET Council member and work with a wonderful group of engineers and well supported by the Secretariat and the UN entities and our sponsors. For my day job, I work for a company called NGSA, which is a French energy company and a leader in transition, of energy transition, which also gives me an opportunity to share what we're doing, learn from colleagues, and then contribute to the energy transition process. So it's been quite an interesting process so far, but I think there's a lot more we need to do and we should be doing. If you could go on to the next slide, Liz, I can start talking about it. So when we look at the technical challenges which need to be addressed and can be addressed, there'll always be distractors who will say, look what happened in Spain, what happened elsewhere. We can't get rid of fossil fuel generation. There is a phased process which needs to be managed. And how do we manage that process without giving the distractors the excuse, while also making sure that we maintain the system stable? So in this, what can we do? With the types of things we are going to talk about, we can contribute to things like grid stability, adequacy, resilience, flexibility, which is required on the system, making sure that the system is reliable, provide the necessary inertia and all the different ancillary services which a system requires, while also making sure that we're decarbonizing the fossil fuel fleet and also managing the transition in a phased manner in which the new technologies will gradually come in over a period of time. We're also looking at what can be done on the existing low carbon fleet to further improve plant efficiency. And also transmission and distribution takes a bit longer to build. How do we make sure that we're giving adequate time for the transmission and distribution build out to happen, which enables this transition to happen, because renewable power usually needs to come from a longer distance at times. And then, of course, ensure that the transition is done in what is a technological and economic balanced way. Next slide, please, Liz. So what are the different types of options which we can think about? I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but really to give an example of the types of things we can do. So retrofitting of coal plants. When we talk about retrofitting, we can do various changes and modifications to lower the carbon emissions from an existing plant. We can put things like improved drives on the plant. We can look at how do we increase efficiency by reducing losses from the assets, etc. So that's just one aspect of it. The second aspect is that how do we also reduce carbon intensity? And that could be done by biomass conversion or co-firing of biomass or ammonia or green gases. And then also look at equipment change, which I just mentioned. And in some cases also look at repowering the coal-fired plant to make it a combined cycle plant, where we can also then look at future combustion with biogas or hydrogen with green gases, etc. And lastly, on coal plants, we can also install carbon capture, utilization, and storage, but these are a bit more site-specific, and we can come to that in the detailed discussion. So retrofitting is really making changes and improvement to improve the emissions, but not really changing the purpose of the plant. It still remains a power generation facility. When we talk about repurposing, it means we change the purpose of what the plant was originally intended to do. So instead of being a generator, can it do other things? For example, if I convert the unit to a synchronous condenser, it's still connected to the power system, but it's providing system stability, support, etc. Or we can convert it to Carnot batteries, which are thermal energy storage systems, which are then providing energy storage, which is providing flexibility and dispatchability on the system. So these are just some examples, and we can go through the details. And I will also be very happy to answer your questions as they come along. With that, I pass it back to you, Liz.
Excellent. Thank you, Jaideep, for this presentation and for talking a little bit about the technical challenges to this managed phase out, and along with the roles of retrofitting and repurposing in this transition. I'm pleased to invite our final presenter, Michael Williamson, to this virtual floor for his presentation on pathways to a coal transition.
Well, thank you very much, Liz, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and warm greetings from Bangkok in the Asia Pacific region. So when we look at Asia, I mean, we do talk about the Asian century, but when we look at coal, in fact, Asia is the location where coal-fired power is really increasing. We see other regions perhaps stabilizing or going into reverse gear in terms of their use in coal, but over the last decade in particular, coal has been the fuel of choice to meet the increased power demand in grids across the Asia Pacific region. And there's probably some reasons for that. I think in many cases you have economies which are growing rapidly. So ministers of energy in different countries have looked for something which is reliable, which is dependable, which is there, and that really has been coal. So this we have the very large coal fleet that Rana pointed to in her remarks, but also what's in the planning pipeline. And that's particularly of concern. And I think this issue of coal in the Asia Pacific region, it throws up two challenges. The first is that we have this shrinking window of opportunity to keep climate change within the safe limits. And if we superimpose that desire with the emissions from this existing and planned coal fleet, we have a fundamental incompatibility. If we continue to run all of this coal and we build all of the new plants, we're not keeping within that carbon budget. That's problem number one. Problem number two relates to the stranded assets issue that Rana also touched upon. When we look at these coal investments, these plants, if they're built in 2025, they will still be operating in 2065. That world of 2065 will be very different to the world of today in terms of energy economics. We'll have a lot more abundant, low-cost renewable energy. We'll have much better energy efficiency, and we'll have a much better system where we can share power across borders. So that means we will see a squeeze on these assets. Already we see in China some very low capacity factors of coal-fired assets. So the investment in these plants is somehow threatened, which brings with it some questions of, financial stability. So already in this year, 2025, we're at an inflection point. So renewables have taken over the power generation system when we think about annual capacity additions. When we look at the report from IRENA that reported figures from last year, renewables have taken the vast majority of both the capacity added, but also the investment. And that's a trend that's not going to go away. This is not a blip. This is something which will continue because the cost of coal will increase. And of course, the cost of renewables continue to decrease. And we have many markets in the Asia Pacific where wind and solar haven't gained a great foothold. There's a lot of technical potential, economic potential to add more. So given this trend, adding more coal is risky because, as I mentioned, we are moving towards a world which is more focused on electricity as a fuel and more electrification of end uses. So we're going to see a growth in the demand for electricity, but also commensurate growth in things like renewables, energy efficiency, gas, cross-border trading of power. And much of this, particularly on the renewable side, it's zero marginal cost. So when you have something which, in a power market which generates with zero marginal cost, it tends to push out the coal-fired power. Now, I guess on the positive side, when we look at renewables, Asia Pacific, not just being the center of coal, it's also the center of renewables, not just the deployment, but also the manufacturing. And this opens up a lot of opportunities for the phase down of coal and replacing them with a series of alternatives. Renewables, gas, energy efficiency, cross-border power. JD pointed to a couple of great examples. I'm sure the engineers are working on even more. And this region has got the experience and the know-how to do these large-scale renewables. And I think in the panel session, we'll talk about how we can juxtapose this new energy world with the old energy world in terms of repurposing a lot of these existing coal-fired power sites. So the key to Asia's success, not just meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but the long-term growth and success of Asia will be how it develops innovative solutions for this managed phase-out. They're not just technology solutions, they're also about the innovative finance. How do you channel climate finance into this sector? And how do you manage the social aspects of this challenge? So these are some things that perhaps we can touch on a little bit more in the panel session. But thank you very much, Liz, for the invite, and I pass the microphone back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael, for discussing some of those economic and market aspects of the energy transition and really articulating the need for a managed phase out of coal in Asia, coupled with the scaling of zero and low carbon energy sources. That was great. Thank you. We're now going to move into the panel portion of our session. So for that, I'd like to invite all of our presenters to join us. And I'm pleased to introduce one of my CEET Secretariat colleagues, Isaac Elizondo Garcia, who will moderate this panel session.
Thank you, Liz. And hello, everyone. My name is Isaac Elizondo Garcia. I'm an energy program coordinator at the Energy and Climate Action Division of UNIDO. And I'm also a member of the CEET Secretariat. And I am delighted to be moderating this panel discussion with such great speakers. I have a number of questions that I'm very eager to ask our panelists today, but I would also like to mention that we will have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit any questions you may have in the chat, and we will do our best to cover as many as possible. Now, to open the conversation, I would like to turn to Michael with a question that will help us set the foundation for today's discussion. Michael, why does Asia present a unique opportunity for a managed phase-out of coal power? And how can Asia serve as an example to the rest of the world transitioning away from fossil fuels?
Sure. Thanks so much, Isaac. I think when we talk about this topic, we really have to think about just transition. And this just transition is a really important part of the lexicon. Asia Pacific, as I'd mentioned in the flash talk, is really the region which is on the forefront of this issue. So governments across the Asia Pacific are looking at the challenge of how do they manage their energy systems to wean them off coal? How do they reduce the planning pipeline? But also eventually thinking about the early retirement of coal-fired power stations. And to some, this might seem like an intractable policy challenge, but putting just transition at the heart of this is really important. I think when we think about just transition for governments of the Asia Pacific, it is not just the ethical and the right way for them to approach it, but it's also the one that brings with it risk mitigation. And I think it brings about risk mitigation because if you have plans that are not supported by communities because they're unjust, it will cause a great problem. It will slow down the whole process. So governments need to approach it with consultation and consensus forming. Now we can see many examples of transition across the Asia Pacific region. We look at places like Australia, we see the Philippines. We're going to see a lot more. And I think in China, they're expecting that about 1 million coal jobs might be lost by 2050. I mean, that is a very big number when we think about it. That's not just in the coal-fired power stations, that's also in the coal mining. So key to the success of this whole energy transition in the Asia Pacific will be thinking about this and really thinking about jobs at the center. So when we think about jobs, it's the old story about the minister going into the election and he says to his ministry, I've got 3 priorities going into this election: jobs, jobs, and jobs. So jobs are really crucial. Yes, there are lots of jobs in fossil fuel industries across the Asia Pacific, and often you find them geographically concentrated where the coal is. So you have a coal mine, a mine mouth power station. Those communities have grown up around that area. Indeed, we've seen some automation over the years that has seen some of those jobs decline. But when we talk about the clean energy transition in Asia Pacific, it's also a very job-rich transition. And when we look at the numbers on our spreadsheets, they tell us there are more jobs per dollar invested in clean energy sectors in Asia than in fossil fuels. So if we look at renewables, for every $1 million we invest, we get about 7.2 to 7.6 jobs generated, whereas coal is about 3.1 jobs per million invested. So renewables are scoring high, but also are energy efficient. But the trap, I think, is that this is comforting to us, but it's a macro level analysis. And that gives us an over-optimistic picture, because the jobs that we're losing are in different places to the jobs that they're created. And there are different skills and different people. So we have a basic mismatch. And in fact, when we look at solar and wind, many of the jobs might be in the country of manufacture, not in the country where the coal is winding down. So that's where we need adjustment packages from governments. The second point to make, which is really important for Asia and the Pacific, is about smoothing this transition by repurposing. So we heard from Jaydeep all of the technologies that can be done. We don't just need to employ new technologies. We need to see how we can reskill the people in those communities to take on those new economic opportunities. And the last thing I would say about what's so important for Asia Pacific is that a lot of the countries are developing their energy plans. They're developing power development plans. They have NDCs. They're looking at the long-term time horizons for their energy systems. It's important to think about the energy transition in the context of jobs and social impacts. This even extends to thinking about the education system. What kind of graduates are we producing? How are they going to feed into the energy industry? How do we need to skill the workers? What are the future skills? What impacts will AI and other technologies have on that? If we have a power development plan that leans heavily on wind and solar, can we then have an industry development policy that promotes local supply chains, local manufacturing? These are some of the considerations which governments in the Asia Pacific will be looking at. So thanks, Isaac. I'll pass back to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for highlighting these challenges, but at the same time, many opportunities for the region and beyond Asia as well. Emmy, building on that, I would like to shift to the technical dimension of this. And I would like to ask you, what are the challenges involved in retrofitting and repurposing fossil fuel generation facilities? What are the potential solutions to each of these?
Thanks, Isaac. Indeed, and like the policy, market, and financial measures, technical solutions, retrofitting or repurposing really involve further financial investments and the physical modification into the existing assets and facilities. Arguably, this will, however, prolong the life of coal assets and may even delay the deployment of renewable energy alternatives. So today, coal firing, for example, with green ammonia is technically feasible at around 20% of blend rate. Biomass is similarly coal-fired at relatively low rate as well. So this suggests the impact of emission reduction from coal firing or efficiency upgrades will have an upper limit. So in this context, we would advise that the most economical and climate-friendly pathway for old and inefficient coal subcritical units is early retirement. In addition, coal firing with fossil gas, biomass, synthetic fuels, ammonia will continue to emit fine particles into the air, so causing air pollutions, health hazards for the public, and thirdly, coal firing with biomass also interfere with agriculture, food, forestry, land resources. This may also increase food insecurity and have negative footprint on environment. And we are talking about 1,600 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants in Asia and over 120 gigawatts capacity in Southeast Asia. So the demand for feedstock for coal firing will be enormous. This also suggests coal firing with biomass or ammonia can only be a temporary solution at a very small scale. Of course, there is also an argument whether it is a better investment option, for example, retrofitting versus clean energy development. So all these need to be considered when the policymakers or energy system planners really thinking about longer term to achieve their environmental and also energy security goals. Some countries, for example, China, has active coal to nuclear policies and programs, so for both electricity and heat generation. It has been quite effective, and a study showed that more than 2/3 of the 3,000 coal-fired power units in China, around 906 gigawatts of capacity are suitable for nuclear retrofit. Of course, the barriers for many developing countries considering coal to nuclear include public acceptance, safety and security risks, long development time frame, and also lack of skilled workforce for development operations of nuclear facilities. So all these solutions will have pros and cons. They are suitable for specific contexts. But what I would like to highlight again is regulatory measures to strengthen emission standards, for example, is very viable and perhaps the easiest to implement solutions to reduce emissions in the coal-fired power plants. This will require retrofitting less efficient coal power plants, but it has been very effective in reducing emissions and increasing plant efficiencies in many countries, in China, EU. Of course, another benefit of more stringent emission standards is that the policy will provide incentives for developers to opt for cleaner technologies, renewables, or for example, super ultra critical coal plants than least efficient subcritical plants. At the present, countries such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines hasn't really put in very strong emission standards for existing coal plants, which is about 3 to 7 times higher than EU standards or China standards in China. So again, strengthening emission standards for coal-fired power plants can be easily put on the policy agenda. However, similarly to fossil fuel subsidies, which is a bigger challenge to tackle as well. So the decision for this is very much an economic one. At the same time, it's also a political one. I'll stop here. Back to you, Isaac. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Emmy. These are very concrete and precise actions that can be taken on different levels. So this is fascinating. And this also brings me to my next question for Jaideep, which is, Jaideep, as more fossil fuel plants are retired or repurposed, maintaining grid resilience, which you mentioned in your presentation, becomes increasingly important. So I want to ask you, what technologies can be implemented to preserve grid resilience and reliability during this transition?
Thank you, Isaac. So there are a number of technologies which already exist. It's about getting them to the scale which we need to have the system stable. So it has been proven, even in more recent events, for example, that when there was a system instability event, technologies such as batteries kicked in very, very quickly. So batteries have a very, very short response time. They also reduce the requirement of inertia, but they have a finite time, and we need a certain level of rollout to achieve the scale which we need to have the system stable. So during that time, this is where I was talking about really using some of the coal plants, retrofitting and repurposing them to provide that phased management, not to keep them in operation in perpetuity, but really to allow a phased transition till the time we can build these new technologies such as battery storage, Carnot batteries, more pumped hydro storage, and you need a lot of extra renewables as well, because you would need the extra capacity to charge all these resources. And then even to meet normal demand, you would really need much more installed capacity than what you would normally need, because you're weather dependent. So the wind will not always be flowing at maximum, or the sun will always won't be shining at its required rate at which we need to get the solar energy done. So you'll have all this extra, which also leads to another issue, which means that we are not only looking at what needs to strengthen the system, but how we make use of that system as well. And how do we actually create a situation in which we do not actually create a scenario in which people don't want to invest in renewables, for example, because they end up with a lot of curtailment or the assets not being dispatched. So this will lead to a system in which, let's say, excess energy can be used for other functions, for example, hydrogen production, or as I said, going to energy storage. Hydrogen production itself, or green gas production itself, is also something which will support the system in being more resilient. So then Also, demand side management is very, very critical. So when we talk about system resilience and stability, we also need to make sure that we can also manage the demand a bit. So various things need to be done to keep the system stable and resilient. But for sure, if you're talking about technologies, it's all the technologies exist: energy storage, extra deployment of renewables, green gases, power to X, etc., which will all enable us to keep the system a lot more stable and reliable.
Great. Thank you, Jaideep. That's very insightful. And if any of the panelists has any responses, feel free to follow up with any comments or questions in this discussion. But in the meantime, I wanted to turn to Nitin. And as we know, energy transitions do not happen in a vacuum. And I want to ask you, Nitin, how can nations strike a balance between long-term decarbonization objectives and short-term energy security?
Thank you, Isaac, for this question. And it was really good to hear from my colleague panelists before about this issue. Well, as you know, balancing energy security and decarbonization is one of the most complex challenges in the energy transition. I have put some thoughts, like how we can maintain that delicate equilibrium in meeting the short-term energy security with the long-term decarbonization objective as part of the commitment that parties have agreed in Paris as part of the Paris Agreement. One option is diversifying the energy mix in short term, maintaining a mix of energy sources to ensure reliability, especially during renewable intermittency. Example, backup from gas or hydro that could be taken into consideration, and in long term, gradually shifting investments towards renewables, more energy storage and grids, while reducing dependency on the fossil fuel. Then the second point that can be taken into consideration is prioritizing the energy efficiency, reducing demand through efficiency measures in building, transportation sector, and industrial sector can deliver quick gains for both security and climate. Well, efficiency is often a low cost as a low-hanging fruit, reducing fossil fuel dependency, and it will buy in time for scaling up the renewable investment in the renewable energy sector. Next point could be that invest in the resilient infrastructure. That is something which is extremely important. Upgrade the electricity grid systems, develop storage systems, improve interconnectivity so that renewable energy can be better absorbed. Well, we know that modern grids help in preventing blackouts, and it makes actually intermittent renewable sources like solar and wind more reliable. So that's something which needs to be taken into consideration. Then the next point, which Michael has also touched upon in his intervention, is ensuring social and political inclusivity. That is extremely important. I mean, like transitioning away from fossil fuel is not something which happens in vacuum, and that is something because there are jobs that are dependent on this industry in large number. So it's extremely important that public should be a part of it, this transition, and that they trust that this transition is going to happen in a just way, and they will not just lose their jobs and be on the road. So that's something extremely important, and that can be done by protecting vulnerable communities, providing them just transition support. As I mentioned in my flash talk also, that there are mechanisms in place, and also in the international negotiations that are now looking into this aspect of just transition. Then we can think of using the transitional fuels, but again, we have to be strategic in terms of how we use these transitional fuels, because if you use it strategically, then they can support grid stability without locking in the fossil fuel investment and infrastructure. Then the last point is aligning policies and investments. I think it's important to have a clear roadmap, including regulatory frameworks to guide private investments towards clean energy while also ensuring that there is a stable supply of electricity. We also need to encourage public-private partnership more to de-risk clean energy investments and projects. So that's some of the ways how this balance can be strived. I think the key is to invest, to be more flexible, invest more in clean energy infrastructure, and come up with policies that enable smooth, fair, and resilient transition. So back to you, Isaac.
Thanks a lot, Nitin. And so far, we've heard a lot of the different considerations that need to be taken into account when phasing out fossil fuels. As we see, this is we need to have a systems perspective, thinking of all the different aspects of this, with the grid infrastructure and the people and skills needed and stranded assets and so on. So it's fascinating. And I think now I would like to turn more to some of the solutions or some of the actions as well that can be taken. And Michael, I want to return to you and ask you, so based on what we have seen in countries that have already begun this process, what lessons or recommendations could be offered to governments that are just beginning this process of either retrofitting or repurposing their coal facilities?
Yeah, thank you so much, Isaac. We're at the tip of the iceberg. I think we're at the start of many, many decades of this challenge for countries around the region. We've got the forerunner countries, and they will provide some good examples and ideas for other countries. But ultimately, many countries across our region use coal, and this is going to come and arrive at their doorstep at some point. So it is a complex challenge, and it needs to be tackled carefully and sensitively. One way of thinking about it is to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for approaching it. I mean, when we recovered from COVID, when Asia Pacific region was staging its economic recovery from COVID, this was the advice of ESCAP: follow the SDGs as a pathway, try to advance the SDGs with every investment, every decision you're making. And I think this follows a similar parallel, because the SDGs address the needs of communities, of the economy, of the environment. And that's a good place to start. We talked already about the just transition and the consultation part. So bringing the community along with you, with the government, is really important. So it's really important that governments tackle this carefully and sensitively. I think also for governments, what they need to realize, it's not just an energy question. So it's a cross-ministerial effort, and they need to engage with many different ministries of environment, ministries of planning, of industry, even of education. These are many, many different strands to this challenge. And I think one thing I would say also is for governments to think big, because decarbonization is a big opportunity. It's not just a cost. I mean, countries go to the COP meetings every year, and the newspapers say, well, this is such a hard problem to solve. Decarbonization is an enormous business opportunity, and the countries and the industries which were quick to move into that space can really take some advantage of it. So I think if governments can really have that big picture vision, it will be very beneficial. And when we think about energy, energy has got several functions. And one thing is, as human beings, it makes our life on this planet easier. It warms us, it entertains us, it helps grow our crops and bring food into supermarkets. And when you go to a hospital, you see the little baby in the incubator with the electricity keeping that baby alive. So that's one side of it. The second side, it's an input to industry. We push energy into the economy, into industry, into manufacturing, data centers. Energy creates GDP dollars. So when you have abundant energy, low-cost energy, it's really assisting the economy. And that's part of the thinking big for countries. One thing I also emphasize is that countries need to be very evidence-driven. So governments need to think very carefully about the evidence, and they need to kind of bridge that science policy divide. They need to get good advice from people. And this is why it's wonderful to have the engineers on the panel. Countries need to be listening to their scientists and their engineers, not chasing pipe dreams or things that don't work, or hanging on to the old dogma from the 1970s and 1980s. We need to really understand we're in a very fast-moving technology space, and the people making the decisions need to be up to speed with all of the pros and cons of the technology. And the last thing I close on is that this is a long-term agenda for governments. It's not for the next election cycle of 2 years. It's not going to stop after a short time. So you need this bipartisan support. Just as with climate change more generally, you need bipartisan support. For this, there needs to be reaching out across the aisles with both political parties of both stripes. They need to agree on it. There needs to be some sort of consensus, and this effort needs to continue over multiple election cycles. It can't become a political football or a wedge. This is the kind of commitment that we need to build in all of the countries where we live and work. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Isaac.
Thanks a lot, Michael. That is great insights. And I would like to also ask now Emmy to bring in the economic and the policy side. What mechanisms, whether economic or policy, can accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels, if you'd like to share with us?
Thanks, Isaac. So we have touched on a number of economic and policy mechanisms earlier on, so including removing coal subsidies or implementing subsidies for renewable energy, coal production caps, strengthen the environmental policy emission standards, carbon pricing or reflective electricity pricing. So I will take this opportunity to highlight economic and policy strategies and actions taken by some countries around the region. So for example, Malaysia has been experimenting a range of policy measures to reduce the coal use. So they have taken steps in removing fossil fuel subsidies, reducing coal dispatch. They also announced that they will not build any new coal plants and is considering early retirement, mothballing or brown to green swaps for its 7 existing coal-fired power plants, totaling 7 gigawatts capacity. Some measures, for example, policy to shift from blanket to targeted subsidies for fossil fuel powered electricity, and also complemented with renewable energy generation subsidies. Secondly, merit order for electricity generated from less efficient coal plants being set to low dispatch priority, and also some power purchasing agreements for more than 7 gigawatts of coal plants will expire in the next 7-8 years. So these also creating conditions for reevaluating the coal generation assets. They also moving forwards towards implementing a carbon tax by 2026, and also very importantly, to explore the just energy transition, co-transition initiatives to for the international communities to help to build that knowledge base and also the capacities to phase out coal and to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Vietnam also stopped issuing new permits for coal-fired power plants. All these actions considered mostly as administrative or regulative measures, but can be very effective in setting the directions and standards for cleaner development and the operation of electricity generations, and reducing the coal use in the longer term. So very importantly, government have played a very key role to signal to the investors, to the market, given that longer term certainty for them to invest into the clean energy generation and phasing out coal little by little. Of course, China is another success story. Although China still has the larger capacity of coal plants and the construction as well, but also China is also the largest renewable energy construction under the way. So adding gigawatts of renewables each week. So China has taken a series of regulatory measures since 2007 to accelerate the closure of small inefficient coal plants, strengthen the emission standards, retrofitting coal plants to cleaner fuels. China also has one of the strictest emission standards now in the world. All this help to really bring back the blue sky, for example, in the big cities and many other cities that used to be very foggy, I guess. It's also launched its national emission trading scheme in 2021, also creating economic incentives to phase down coal and develop more renewables. So all these measures are quite important for the policymaker to set up as a very conducive ecosystem, I guess, for investors and for the developers as well in the region. Thank you, Isaac. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Emmy. And these measures are also greatly outlined in the brief that you co-authored for the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition. So we will share the link if we haven't yet on the chat. But I still have two more questions that I would like to ask our panelists before we move to addressing some questions from the Q&A. But just wanted to ask you, Jaideep, earlier you spoke about grid reliability and looking ahead. How can these repurposed facilities help create more energy stability and security to avoid recent challenges that we have seen?
Yeah, so first of all, when we look at these repurposed or retrofitted facilities, we are talking about those solutions which are actually helping to strengthen the network or keep the network strong, I would say, while the transition is ongoing, while the new infrastructure is being built out. I mean, let's be clear, we have to build the infrastructure of the future, not the infrastructure of the past, for it to be competitive, for it to be reliable, and also withstand the test of time going in the future. Otherwise, they'll end up with more stranded assets. So in all of these things, when we're talking about doing retrofitting, we're talking about, let's say, putting co-firing of biomass for a period of time. Or we are looking at carbon capture, which is very, very site-specific because you need to have the storage capacities, etc. Otherwise, it consumes too much of power. And moreover, when these types of things are done, the asset owner is again making a significant amount of investment. So they also need some protection on their own investment. So the states and the regulators also need to be mindful of the fact that they will have to help and provide support for making sure that these investments not only happen in renewables, but also happen in these retrofits and repurposing. On the repurposing, for example, when we put, we convert a coal unit, for example, as a synchronous condenser, it is really helping, again, to manage the stability and resilience of a network when you have rapid changes. So when you are adding more renewables, you're saying, okay, I'm adding a bit of intermittency to the system. In reality, you're managing that with all these retrofitted systems, plus with energy storage. And over a period of time, the system will evolve into a completely clean system. But that will take time. And while that is happening, we need to make sure that all the investments which are happening in this space are also protected. But it's keeping a lot of rotating mass on the system. It's adding inertia. It's adding technology, it's keeping technology on the system in a different way, which is already well proven and established. So thereby reducing all of this risk while the transition takes place. We also talk about new technologies being mostly inverter-based resources because asynchronous generation. These are all synchronous generation forms as well. So in the end, everything will be managed. There is engineering solution to everything. It comes at a cost. But how do we manage that in a more controlled way? How do we make sure that the assets are protected while you're doing this to a certain extent? And taking Emmy's point, the old units obviously need to be retired. Those are, it makes no sense of having suboptimal plant running on the system. But also in developing Asia, which is a large part of Asia, there's also growing demand for electricity. So we also need to make sure that while we are adding renewables, we are adding all sorts of generation, there's also rising demand. And to manage all of that needs a bit of both for a period of time. But when we keep the existing facility, we need to make sure it's as low in carbon as possible, with a clear intent to make it completely decarbonized over a period of time, while making sure that the systems remain stable. I mean, Nitin mentioned it very well. We need to make sure that we have the interconnections as well. Usually a political hot potato, because again, people talk about energy independence, but interconnections make you somewhat dependent on each other. But that's the way of, that's a fact of life. And we live in an interconnected world. So the power system will have to be interconnected for more stability as well.
Great, thank you, Jaideep. And that's a great quote, that there are engineering solutions for everything. And indeed, some of the energy services like stability and inertia that repurposing or retrofitting can provide, they perhaps don't gain the most attention in the general discourse, but they are essential for, especially in general, for the power system, but also when phasing out fossil fuels, when integrating more intermittent renewables. So thanks for highlighting this. And now I would like to move to one question for Nitin, as we consider the impact of the energy transition on people and communities. And we've already heard some points from you and from Michael, but I want to get your views on what are the social consequences on phasing out fossil fuels, and how can we ensure a just, clean energy transition in this context?
Thank you, Isaac. And I think we have already touched upon some of the points in previous interventions. Let me just bring it to you that there are several social consequences of phasing out fossil fuel. The most prominent one is job losses in carbon-intensive industries. As we all know that millions of workers in coal mining, oil drilling, and gas processing related factors face potential unemployment with the transition, with complete transition actually. And I think Michael has also touched upon this point that jobs are often regionally concentrated. So it may lead to localized economic collapse if the transition is not happening in a just way. Of course, there are economic disruptions in fossil-dependent economies, which are like OPEC states. They are highly dependent on fossil fuel exports, and that's one of the major consequences of phasing out fossil fuel. We also know that in these countries, important sectors such as healthcare and education are funded by fossil revenues, because they are the major sources of revenues for national governments. So we need to keep into that also in consideration. There are community dislocation and social inequality issues that may come up with this transition, especially if marginalized groups are excluded from clean energy jobs. So we need to keep that as well into consideration when we are transitioning to cleaner fuels. And we often see that it's actually the rural and indigenous communities that are the ones who face any kind of transition that happens. They are the ones who face the most impact. So we need to be very careful when we are making this transition, that utmost care should be taken, especially for people who are indigenous and living in rural areas. We also need to, there are cultural impacts of this transition, and because there are certain communities where fossil industries are like local identity. There's there's a history, and so we need to keep that also into consideration. Well, how can we ensure that no one is, we don't leave people behind? I think we need to think about a proper just transition framework. As I was talking to you earlier, within the UNFCCC negotiation process at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, just transition work program was adopted by parties, which is to ensure that climate actions, especially the shift away from fossil fuel, is socially inclusive and it leaves no one behind. This just transition work program was operationalized at COP28 in Dubai. Again, the main goal of the Just Transition Work Program is to support people and communities which are impacted by climate actions, especially workers which are working in high carbons related sectors. And this transitional work program takes into consideration to promote decent work and quality jobs for climate resilient and low carbon economies. Other options is that we have to keep into consideration that we need to keep implementing worker retaining programs. There should be income support to communities and nations that are most impacted because of this transition process. We need to support community-led planning for regional economic diversification. That's also extremely important. And then there should be direct public investments in affected areas to create green jobs, which are mostly impacted by the closure of mines, for instance, or power plants that are completely based on fossil fuel right now. We need to also think about upgrading infrastructure, and education is extremely important. I guess some of the panelists identified that as an area, so as to ensure that there is an investment attractiveness to diverse industries so that people can get jobs in this area. We also have to come up with global financial support, especially for vulnerable countries, least developed economies, and least developed countries at the most. So these are some of the measures that can be taken into consideration while transitioning away from the fossil fuel to make sure that we are transitioning in a just and equitable way. So that's all from my side, Isaac.
Thanks, Nitin. That this is a crucial aspect of phasing out fossil fuels. And actually, I was looking at the Q&A questions that we've received and registration questions, and there were some that I think you've just answered with this last points. So thanks a lot. And perhaps we're just 3 minutes from closing away, but I still do want to just get to one question, and I would ask the panelists to just keep your answer to 1 minute, whoever would like to take it. But this question is related to finance, and it's how can blended finance or innovative funding platforms be structured to incentivize private sector investment in coal to renewable? If anyone would like to take this question, or if you'd like me to repeat, please let me know.
I probably try it. It is a very complex question to answer. I guess it's not a one-line answer. Of course, all the structured finance, or for example, the coal phase-out initiatives. So I guess the process at the moment is very much trial and error as well. So there are many objectives that need to be balanced. So for coal transition, from moving from environmental objectives to economic objectives to social objectives, it is a really complex systems that you're trying to balance here to suit multiple objectives. So of course, it's up to all the stakeholders, for the governments, industry, community, and the financiers to work together to find the best solutions, to find the best prospects options for moving forward with the coal transition, which is one of the most complex and challenging problems that we face in Asia region.
Just want to add on to what Amy has said, Isaac, because as she has highlighted, it's a complex challenge that we are facing. And again, I think, of course, we need innovative financial instruments to deal with this issue of financing. But carbon markets, for instance, can be used to leverage and attract more investment to renewables. That's something which we can, I just want to add on to what Amy has suggested.
Great. Thanks a lot, Emi and Nitin. And unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to conclude here. Would have loved to continue this conversation for much longer, but Emi, Jaideep, Michael, and Nitin, thank you all for your fascinating insights. It has been a real pleasure to hear from from each of you. And thank you as well to our audience for your attention and thoughtful questions. Liz, I will now hand it over back to you for any final remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, Isaac, thank you for that. And thank you. I just want to acknowledge and again echo Isaac's thanks to all of our panelists for their excellent presentations and contributions to the discussion today. Additionally, I want to share a thank you to you, Isaac, for your excellent moderation and support of this session. Lastly, I specifically want to acknowledge and thank our co-hosting organizations for this session, including UNIDO, UNFCCC, and ESCAP. A big thank you to these organizations for their support and partnership of the CEET. It's very clear that this is and needs to be an ongoing discussion about these technical pathways and solutions to advancing a managed phase out of fossil fuels and specifically coal in Asia and around the world. We encourage you to review the recent CEET publications on this topic. We can put the links to that in the chat, and we'll also share those in our follow-up email as well. Lastly, just a note that this session was part of a CEET webinar series on insights and innovations for a sustainable energy future. You'll be able to find the recording of this session along with the recordings of our past 2 discussions on energy rating labels and clean cooking solutions on our SDSN YouTube channel. And again, we will send the links to that in our follow-up email. I encourage everyone to keep an eye out for the final session of our series, which will be confirmed in the coming weeks. But that's all for today. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Isaac. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.